The story of Johnson & Johnson is a tale that begins not in a sterile laboratory or a clinical trial room, but in the gritty, soot-dusted streets of New Brunswick, New Jersey. Founded in 1886 by three brothers, Robert, James, and Edward Johnson, the company started with a simple mission: to make surgery safer. They were among the first to mass-produce sterile surgical supplies, something revolutionary at a time when doctors operated in blood-stained aprons and reused tools without a second thought. By the mid-20th century, Johnson & Johnson had grown into a sprawling empire. Their red and white logo became a familiar sight in medicine cabinets across America. Band-Aids, baby oil, talcum powder, these weren't just products, they were rituals, woven into the daily lives of families. But behind the soft branding and comforting messaging, the company had developed a sharper edge. The 1950s were a turning point for pharmaceuticals. Antibiotics like penicillin had revolutionized treatment, and tranquilizers were transforming mental health care. The next frontier? Pain. Managing it, eliminating it, controlling it. Johnson & Johnson had their eyes on a deeper piece of the healthcare puzzle. Bandages were fine, baby shampoo sold well, but the real power and the real profit was in prescription drugs. They needed to move beyond the supermarket shelves and into the hospital corridors, into the hands of doctors and the pages of medical journals. That's when they turned their gaze toward Europe. While American drug makers were busy consolidating their domestic power, a quieter revolution was happening abroad. Small, research-heavy labs in Europe were innovating at a breathtaking pace. A sleepy town in the post-war years, nestled among quiet forests and cobblestone streets. To the casual observer, it seemed an unlikely place for a revolution. But behind the brick walls of a modest pharmaceutical lab, a man was on the verge of something that would alter the course of modern medicine. Dr. Paul Janssen was unlike the conservative physicians of his time. In an era when many doctors still leaned on folk wisdom and trial and error, Janssen was a scientist in the truest sense, a man of numbers, data, and ruthless precision. His fascination with chemistry bordered on obsession. To him, molecules were not just substances, they were instruments of hope, of control, of salvation. Born in 1926 to a family of pharmacists, Janssen's path to medicine felt preordained, but he was never content to simply fill prescriptions. By the time he earned his medical degree, he had already resolved to create better drugs, more targeted, more efficient, more powerful. In 1953, at the age of just 27, he founded his own company, Janssen Pharmaceutical. He started small, 6 employees in a repurposed barn, but within a decade the lab became one of Europe's leading centers of pharmaceutical innovation. His team had already produced treatments for psychosis, nausea, and fungal infections, but none of those compounds would carry the weight of what came next. Janssen's attention turned to opioids in the mid-1950s. It wasn't just curiosity, it was necessity. In surgery and trauma care, the medical community was still relying heavily on morphine and meperidine, both powerful but deeply flawed. Morphine was slow and imprecise. Meperidine caused toxic side effects with repeated use. Johnson believed he could do better. His approach was mathematical. He didn't rely on guesswork. He mapped the opioid receptor site in the brain and modeled the precise shape that a synthetic molecule would need to bind to it, efficiently, quickly, and with minimal side effects. In 1960, after hundreds of failed attempts, the breakthrough came: fentanyl, a compound so potent that only micrograms were needed to induce full anesthesia. To Janssen, it was everything modern medicine demanded: fast-acting, short-lived in the body, and supremely efficient. He tested it on animals first: mice, dogs, monkeys. The results were extraordinary. Heart rates remained stable. Breathing was less depressed. Recovery was faster. It was as if he had unlocked a cheat code to pain management. But Janssen wasn't blind to fentanyl's risks. He knew its strength could be a double-edged sword. In large doses, it could suppress breathing entirely. It could kill. But in his view, those risks could be mitigated by careful dosing and professional administration. Use it in the hands of trained anesthesiologists, he said, and it will save lives. In 1963, he presented his findings to leading European medical authorities. Many were impressed. A few were awestruck. Word spread, and international buzz began to build. Back in the United States, Johnson & Johnson watched closely. Their recent acquisition of Janssen Pharmaceutica was looking more and more like a goldmine. They believed fentanyl could be the new gold standard for surgical anesthesia, not just in the US, but globally. All that was needed was one final step: FDA approval. And that's when they ran into resistance. A highly respected professor of anesthesiology had already reviewed Janssen's research. He saw something others missed, something that troubled him deeply. His name was Dr. Robert Drips, and he was about to become the one man standing between fentanyl and America. In the early 1960s, Few names carried more weight in the world of anesthesiology than Dr. Robert Drips. He was a towering figure in American medicine, not because of flair or bravado, but because of his unshakable integrity. A professor at the University of Pennsylvania and the chairman of its Department of Anesthesiology, Drips was known for his rigorous approach to science and his absolute refusal to bend under corporate influence. To Drips, medicine wasn't a business. It was a sacred responsibility. He had spent his career pioneering safer, more effective methods of putting people under during surgery. He understood the power of anesthetics better than anyone, and he also understood their dangers. Anesthetics could save lives. They could also take them, quietly, quickly, and without warning. So when the reports about fentanyl began to circulate, Drips was immediately intrigued. Here was a new synthetic opioid that promised a cleaner, faster path to unconsciousness. The science was compelling. But something didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just the potency of fentanyl that troubled him. It was the speed. Any compound that acts that quickly and that powerfully, he once said, has to be treated like a loaded gun. He requested the data. He reviewed every trial, every animal study, every dosing chart. What he found disturbed him. While the drug's anesthetic properties were indeed remarkable, its therapeutic index, the margin between a helpful dose and a lethal one, was alarmingly narrow. Worse, he noticed a trend in the trials. Small errors in dosage led to severe respiratory depression. In rats, a slight overdose stopped breathing in seconds. In dogs, cardiac arrest. The margin for error was razor thin. Drips imagined what could happen if such a drug fell into the hands of less experienced practitioners. Or worse, if it somehow leaked outside the hospital. He wasn't just thinking like a doctor, he was thinking like a historian, someone who understood that medicine had a long, painful record of miracle drugs becoming monsters. So Drips took a stand. He wrote a formal letter to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, voicing his opposition to fentanyl's approval in its current form. He spoke at medical conferences, warning his peers that this drug, while brilliant in the lab, could spell disaster in the real world. He even gave interviews to medical journals, calling fentanyl a compound with explosive potential, both medically and socially. The medical establishment listened, some with admiration, others with annoyance, but in corporate boardrooms at Johnson & Johnson, Drips's voice was a problem. A very big problem. For them, fentanyl wasn't just a scientific breakthrough, it was a business strategy. Billions of dollars were potentially at stake. Hospitals, surgeons, anesthesiologists, everyone wanted faster, cleaner ways to sedate patients. Fentanyl could become the centerpiece of operating rooms across America, but first it needed FDA approval. And the FDA was listening closely to Dr. Robert Drips. That's when Paul Janssen himself decided to intervene. Despite being worlds apart in temperament, Johnson admired Drips. He respected his brilliance, even as he found his opposition frustrating. Janssen believed that if he could just explain the science, really walk Drips through the pharmacology, he could win him over. He arranged for a private meeting in Philadelphia, but Drips refused. He didn't want a sales pitch. He didn't want reassurances. He wanted proof that this drug could be administered safely, predictably, and without creating the next public health crisis. Janssen was undeterred. He worked with his team to draft a proposal, a compromise. The plan was to dilute fentanyl to a 50% ratio, drastically reducing its potency per dose. It would still be effective in surgical settings but far less likely to be abused or misused. The FDA, presented with this compromise, tentatively agreed. In exchange, Dr. Drips agreed to withdraw his public opposition, under the condition that the drug would be used only in controlled medical environments, with tight regulation. In 1968, the FDA approved fentanyl for use, but only in this diluted form. It was a victory for Janssen. It was a compromise for Drips. And it was a moment in history when medicine chose hope, cautiously, over fear. But as with many well-intentioned deals, the cracks would soon begin to show. In the spring of 1968, the halls of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration were tense with deliberation. On the table was a decision that could redefine the future of anesthesia. Should fentanyl be approved for use in American hospitals? The debate had raged for over a year. On one side were the scientists and executives from Janssen Pharmaceutical, now operating under the wing of Johnson & Johnson. Backed by data, patents, and the promise of innovation, they presented fentanyl as a surgical miracle, ultra-potent, fast-acting, and ideal for tightly controlled environments like the operating room. On the other side stood Dr. Robert Drips, supported by a coalition of cautious clinicians. His warnings about fentanyl's high potency and abuse potential had resonated deeply within the FDA. No one questioned its efficacy. The question was whether its risks could be contained. The compromise they reached that year would echo through history. The FDA granted approval, but under strict conditions. fentanyl would be introduced to the American market in a heavily diluted form, with a 50% ratio to its pure compound. The idea was simple. By dramatically lowering the available dosage, the risk of overdose and abuse would be minimized. The diluted formulation would be administered only by licensed anesthesiologists, for use in hospitals and surgical centers. For Dr. Drips, it was a reluctant concession. He made one final stipulation: the FDA must uphold these restrictions, and if any company sought to reintroduce a more potent form for broader use, he would return to the front lines of opposition. For Paul Janssen, it was an acceptable sacrifice. He believed in fentanyl's future, and this was just the first step. Within months of approval, hospitals across the United States began to stock the drug. Anesthesiologists were quick to embrace it. The early reviews were glowing. Patients went under quickly and woke up faster, with fewer complications. Surgeries became smoother. Recovery times shortened. Some doctors even called it the best tool we've had since the invention of the scalpel. Fentanyl's integration into modern surgery was rapid and profound, but the euphoria masked a quieter shift taking place beneath the surface. Pharmaceutical reps began pushing the product harder, showing up to hospitals with literature, free samples, and promises of state-of-the-art sedation. Some hospitals, encouraged by the glowing feedback, began to experiment off-label, testing the drug in trauma wards, cancer clinics, even emergency rooms. The FDA's control was supposed to be airtight. But in the real world, enforcement was porous. Hospitals had protocols, doctors had preferences, and pharmaceutical reps had incentives. Meanwhile, Johnson & Johnson saw the numbers. Sales were climbing steadily, and interest in fentanyl was growing outside of surgery. Palliative care doctors were taking notice. So were trauma surgeons. And in Europe, whispers began of new, stronger formulations being tested for patients with severe chronic pain. Back in Belgium, Paul Janssen watched this unfold with a mix of pride and anxiety. He had created a compound of extraordinary power, and it was behaving exactly as designed. But could its power be controlled in a world as chaotic and inconsistent as modern healthcare? Dr. Drips certainly didn't think so. Though he had stepped back from public opposition, he kept his eye on the drug's spread. Each off-label use, each new indication, each whisper of broader applications, it all felt like the beginning of a long, dangerous drift away from the original agreement. And Drips wasn't wrong, because just 4 years after the diluted version of fentanyl was approved, pharmaceutical interest in its original potency began to resurface. The reason? Demand. The same qualities that made fentanyl a marvel in the operating room, its speed, efficiency, and power, were now being seen as assets outside of surgery too. Hospices wanted it for end-of-life care. Cancer clinics asked for higher doses for patients in unrelenting pain. Emergency departments looked to it for trauma victims in need of immediate sedation, and all of them were asking the same question: why can't we have the stronger version? Behind the scenes, pressure began to build on the FDA to loosen restrictions. Slowly, cautiously, the agency responded. New formulations were proposed. Revised delivery mechanisms, patches, lozenges, even IV drips were introduced, each promising control and precision. But control, as history would soon prove, is rarely absolute. The floodgates hadn't opened yet, but the locks were beginning to rust. The success of fentanyl in the operating room was undeniable. By the early 1970s, anesthesiologists across the country were calling it a game changer. It delivered what decades of surgical medicine had promised but rarely achieved: a sedative that was fast, smooth, and clean. But even as doctors celebrated its virtues, a quiet shift was underway, one that few noticed, and fewer still understood. The diluted version of fentanyl, the 51 formulation approved under the original FDA agreement, was doing its job, but it had sparked a hunger for more. More control, more flexibility, more potency. Hospitals began pushing the boundaries, not out of recklessness, but out of need. Chronic pain patients, especially those with terminal cancer, didn't respond well to morphine anymore. Trauma patients arriving in emergency departments needed relief now, not in 10 minutes. Paramedics, working in the chaos of roadside accidents, begged for a sedative they could administer quickly and reliably. So began the era of off-label use. In medical literature, off-label doesn't necessarily mean illegal. It means using a drug in a way not specifically approved by the FDA. Doctors are legally allowed to do it, and often do, when they believe it's in the patient's best interest. But in the case of fentanyl, off-label use started to blur the very boundaries Dr. Drips had fought so hard to put in place. Hospitals began to quietly stock higher concentrations, arguing they needed flexibility for different types of cases. Janssen Pharmaceutica, now deep under the Johnson & Johnson umbrella, began introducing new formulations with FDA approval, injectable variants, transdermal patches, and eventually lozenges for slow-release pain relief. Each version came with a slick pamphlet and a bold claim: safe, effective, and controlled. But every new format also came with a question that no one could confidently answer: how do you stop something this powerful from falling into the wrong hands? In a way, fentanyl was doing exactly what it had been engineered to do. It wasn't the drug that changed, it was the world around it. One of the earliest signs of trouble came not from hospitals, but from veterinary clinics. Fentanyl was so effective at knocking out large animals, horses, lions, even elephants, that it became a staple in exotic animal medicine. But the veterinary variant, sometimes even more concentrated than the hospital version, wasn't always tightly secured. In one infamous case, a zoo technician in California took a vial home, just to see what it felt like. He was found dead the next morning, his breathing stopped mid-sleep. The DEA took notice. Then came the reports from ambulances and trauma centers, instances of accidental overdose, nurses fainting after accidental exposure, IVs miscalibrated, doctors prescribing higher doses to patients without properly explaining the side effects. In every case, the cause wasn't malice. It was ease. Fentanyl was easy to administer, easy to increase, easy to miscalculate. And then, somewhere in the early 1970s, it happened. Fentanyl was found on the street. It started in whispers. A medical supply shipment intercepted in a break-in. A rogue lab assistant caught siphoning off residue. Someone, somewhere, had reverse-engineered the compound, and what had once been a hospital-only anesthetic had now entered the unregulated, chaotic world of underground chemistry. At first, it was rare. Heroin was still the dominant street opioid, but the dealers and underground chemists quickly realized something shocking. Fentanyl was cheaper to make. A tiny amount, barely a few grains, could simulate the effects of a much larger dose of heroin. More profit, more potency, more danger. The drug didn't smell. It didn't taste. It could be cut into pills or powders without detection, and because it was so concentrated, it was nearly impossible for a street-level user to know how much was too much. Back in Philadelphia, Dr. Drips read the early DEA reports with growing dread. This wasn't the future he had imagined when he agreed to the FDA compromise. This wasn't controlled use. This was a slow breach of the wall. Fentanyl had crossed the line, from tool to temptation.